Hello, and thank you for tuning into our program tonight. We especially appreciate your patience with the technical issues we were experiencing earlier. Tonight, of course, we are presenting Sacco and Vanzetti, The Enduring Legacy. My name is Mariana Gatto. I'm the Executive Director of the Italian American Museum of Los Angeles. A special greeting to the IAMLA members and sponsors whose generosity helps make programs such as this possible. We'd also like to extend a warm welcome to the members of the Italian Sons and Daughters of America and thank the ISDA for its support. Tonight's program is presented as part of a multi-year commemoration of the centennial of the Sacco and Vanzetti case. Before we get started, we'd like to let you know that some of the images and topics included in the discussion are better suited for mature audiences. So if you have children in the house, now would be a good time to make whatever modifications you deem necessary. We will be taking your questions during the latter part of the program, so don't hesitate to post a question in the comments section of this live Facebook feed as the discussion is underway. Our presenter this evening is Neil Thomas Proto, an Italian-American lawyer, teacher, lecturer, and author. As a law student at George Washington University, Neil chaired Students Challenging Regulatory Agency Procedures. The group's advocacy led to the landmark US Supreme Court decision, the first full court consideration of the American National Environmental Policy Act. Neil later served in the appellate section of the Environment and Natural Resources Division of the US Department of Justice. During the administration of President Jimmy Carter, Neil served as general counsel to the President's Nuclear Safety Oversight Committee. Neil was appointed a visiting lecturer at Yale University in 1988 and 1989, and since 1990, while in private practice in Washington, D.C., he has been an adjunct professor at Georgetown University's McCourt School of Public Policy. In 2010, Neil was elected a fellow in the Royal Geographical Society of London. Neil has authored various books. His most recent, which we will be giving away a copy, or a few copies, I should say, of tonight, is entitled Fearless, A. Bartlett Giamatti and the Battle for Fairness in America. The book examines the early years of Giamatti, who would become Yale University's first non-Anglo-Saxon Protestant president and a commissioner of Major League Baseball. Welcome, Neil.
Thank you, Mariana. I appreciate it.
Now, let's jump right into the program, given we're running a little bit late, but I know very many people are looking forward to this, so we're going to still take our time. Given the amount of upward mobility and acceptance that Italian Americans have achieved, many people, including many Italian Americans themselves, are surprised to discover that the process by which we arrived at this point in our ethnicity was anything but easy. For many Italian immigrants of yesteryear and their descendants, it was a quite painful process. And those traumas shaped and continue to influence Italian American self-perception. One of the topics that we examine at the IAMLA in length is how Italian Americans were often pitted between retaining their cultural values and being accepted as Americans. Neil, tell us a little bit, if you will, about what was taking place in Italy during the years leading up to the massive, largely Southern Italian immigration, of which Sacco and Vanzetti were part, and describe some of the things that Italian immigrants and their descendants faced in the United States, and how this treatment and the widely held perceptions factored into the Sacco and Vanzetti case.
Thank you, Mariana. I would be glad to do that. I'm foremost grateful to you and your colleagues for organizing this evening's discussion. Hopefully we've crafted a program that will be informative, perhaps revelatory, and perhaps even provocative. I'm especially appreciative and welcome the participation of the Italian Sons and Daughters of America. They have a unique and special history. I believe it reflects the values and principles that will emerge in this discussion. Now to your questions. Why did these immigrants, almost exclusively from Southern Italy, leave a newly formed nation? What did they confront in the United States? And what was the cultural framework within which the Sacco and Vanzetti controversy emerged? I'm going to start with something personal, though more broadly applicable than I originally thought. My mother was born in December 1910 in a small mountain village east of Naples. I learned many years later that before she was born, a great uncle on her father's side had traveled to America in the early 1870s, remained about a year and returned. That is, he acted the scout, not the immigrant. It was not unusual. I learned too that when the families of Sacco and Vanzetti, although coming from very different parts of Italy, had an identical experience. Why were these families and their neighbors intent on leaving a nation, Italy, that was barely a decade old? My mother came to America through Ellis Island in 1916 with her mother, a seamstress, and her brother in steerage. Naples was the port of departure. The ship was dangerous, sickness was common, and the Italian government made no effort to ensure safety or to keep them in Italy. My grandfather was already in New Haven. He'd come earlier, now definitely the immigrant. Contrary to the mythology, these Southern Italians did not come wholly because the economy of the South collapsed. They wanted freedom from the military oppression and economic exploitation by Northern Italians, and a desire for fairness in the United States, that is, no discrimination. They did not find it. Southern Italian immigrants were dark-skinned, didn't speak English, were largely Catholic, were disdained within their own country, and as I'll describe in a moment, they were considered genetically unfit and a threat in the United States. They could infect the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant gene pool with intermarriage and require public expenditures if those among them who were unfit were allowed to increase. The courage to cross an ocean, which we all often and correctly attribute to our grandparents and great-grandparents, required yet more courage and intuitive skill to live and to raise children once they arrived in America. Let me go backwards. I'm going to take you to 1860, early 1860, before there was a nation called Italy. The peninsula was divided roughly south of Rome. The Pope was in Rome, protected by the French. Above Rome in the north was the Piedmont, whose king was Victor Emmanuel. The nation called the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies, ruled by the Spanish family monarch, King Francis II, was located in Naples and governed the remainder of the peninsula. The Southern Revolution for Independence began in Sicily against the King's army. It was March and April 1860, the early moments in the United States of the American Civil War. The Southern Revolution was joined and then led up the peninsula by Giuseppe Garibaldi and tens of thousands of volunteers, women and men, including from the towns and villages that a generation later sent family members to America. Northerners from the Piedmont region did nothing to help. In fact, they considered the Southerners to be Africans, said with all the denigrating intent you can imagine. And they sent troops to Rome to aid the French in protecting the Pope as the Southerners got closer. Once the Southern volunteers took Naples and its considerable wealth, excellent port facilities, and Europe's largest university, they stopped. Many had died. They wanted independence. Women workers wanted fair treatment. They all wanted to return to their families. They were convinced and coerced to accept unification with the promise of democracy. That is when Italy became a nation. It was built on a lie. The outcome was ugly and vicious. 100,000 Northern troops invaded the South. Villages were burned, men and women, children shot, concentration camps established. An estimated 80,000 women and men fought a guerrilla war against the Northerners. Brigands, the Northerners told the world, they were criminals. In the Neapolitan dialect, they were resistance fighters, like Francis Marion during the American Revolution, the swamp fox. Martial law was declared by the North so that family members of a fighter could be executed without trial. Whole villages were destroyed. The estimate is that between 125,000 and 150,000 Southern Italians were killed or died in concentration camps. Records were kept by Northern officials of people killed in each village, a body count. All the financial resources in Naples and elsewhere were confiscated and sent north. The port facility was neglected to the benefit of the one in Genoa, and heavy taxation was imposed to pay for the cost of the Northern Army. The entire economy failed. Resistance, especially led by women, continued into 1870s and in Sicily into the 1890s. Italian historians now consider that Northern conduct genocide.
Yeah. And I've heard it described as also one of the first and most forgotten civil wars and ethnic cleansings in modern European history.
That is an absolutely correct and fair characterization. It was ugly and it was brutal, and what I described in a paragraph or two hardly does justice to the ugliness of it. Within a generation, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead, sorry. I was agreeing with, apologize.
Within a generation, Southern Italian families began to plan for departure. That is when my great-great-uncle and many others journeyed to America. Who within the family would stay behind? Who would go? And to where? To Boston, to New Orleans, to Ellis Island. Northern Italians, with the support of white Anglo-Saxon Protestants in the United States, especially at Yale University, sought to distinguish themselves from Southerners leaving for America. They did it in three ways. One, Yale graduate Madison Grant, in his book, The Passing of the Great Race, published in 1916, wrote this, quote, "A group not homogeneous with the old Native American population," and he wasn't talking about indigenous people, "is the Italian. It began arriving after 1870, then it became a flood. Northern Italy was furnished with some fine types of immigrants. Southern Italy, which formed a great mass of Italian immigrants, was an extremely inferior type, of quite a different racial stock from those of the more northerly provinces," unquote. The Northerners were considered Nordic. Prominent Harvard, Princeton, Stanford faculty and graduates, Protestant clergy throughout America, major nonprofits, Rockefeller, Carnegie, major museums, and the Ku Klux Klan embraced and advocated the same view. The American Eugenics Society was formed in 1910, its main office in Cold Springs Harbor, New York, and its headquarters for 18 years in New Haven, and chaired by Yale faculty and supported by its president. Two, at the insistence of the Northern Italian government, when Southern Italians disembarked at Ellis Island, they were classified by the United States Immigration Service not merely by nationality, Italian, but by race, South. Both the Italian and the United States government wanted them separated out, different, for all to see and know. And three, more than 30 states, Indiana was first, California and Connecticut followed, beginning in 1909, enacted eugenics laws that allowed doctors and others to institutionalize and involuntarily sterilize men and women they considered unfit. Bad eyesight, hearing, epilepsy, alcoholism, autism, feeble-mindedness, promiscuity, moral degeneracy. The list was arbitrary, and so was the record keeping. primary concern in many states were Southern Italians and Eastern Europeans. Sterilization occurred mostly among women. In California, it was Mexicans, Asians, and the poor of Oklahoma, the Okies so-called, John Steinbeck's Grapes of Wrath. 20,000 were sterilized, at least, in California. Those laws had their strongest advocacy at Yale, Harvard, Princeton, Stanford, and Carnegie. Those laws continued in force and were used. Involuntary sterilization until the 1960s. I'm going to go briefly back to Yale just for a moment. Let me read you this statement by the president of Yale in 1933. Quote, "It seems quite clear," Yale President James Roland Angell wrote in 1933 as he surveyed the Italian and Jewish immigrant and African-American population that surrounded the university, that if we could have an Armenian massacre confined to the New Haven district, with occasional incursions into Bridgeport and Hartford, we might protect our Nordic stock almost completely, unquote. At Yale during that time, actually beginning earlier, Northern Italians led the study of Southern Italians. They were characterized as uneducable, without morals, and certain to raise criminals, that is, unfit. This was not the sentiment of an era, but a mentality with practical consequences in law and other forms of discrimination in denied opportunities. They began earlier and lasted much longer.
You know, as you so eloquently described, and you know, these weren't isolated incidents or fringe theories. You know, these were, this was a worldview, perception of Italians that was promoted and embraced by some of the most prominent and respected voices in America at the time. You know, in addition to Madison Grant, another person who comes to mind is William Ripley, who was a lecturer at Columbia and professor at MIT. And you know, he argued in his book, Races of Europe, published in 1899, that Europeans could be classified into or categorized into three distinct races: Teutonic, Alpine, and Mediterranean. And that Southern Italians, as members of the so-called Mediterranean race, were inferior to the Alpine or the French and Northern Italian Austrians and the Teutonics or the German and Scandinavian races. In his book, he writes, "Beyond the Pyrenees begins Africa." And you know, I find that quote just very telling about what was the broadly held beliefs at that time.
I appreciate you bringing that up, Mariana, because it tells you how deeply held these beliefs were. And as I just described, when you get, and this is important because it repeats itself, when you start looking at the eugenics laws, they are laws. They are finding a way in the United States to make legal discrimination in a very ugly way. And this mentality, it continues for a long time. I raise Yale. I raise it very purposefully, not only because I'm from there, but it's part of what I examine in great detail at when I did my Giamatti book. And although it might be the subject of a different talk at a different time, which of course I'm glad to do, that mentality was not only taught at Yale for decades, but it does play out in urban renewal. I'm just going to mention that in passing. I don't want us to go, because I'm going to come back to where I just left off.
Yeah,
but
we will do another discussion at another time on that topic.
Yes, but it does play out. And that Armenian massacre actually did occur in New Haven. 30,000 people, all these largely Italian immigrants, Jewish immigrants and African Americans were totally displaced for the benefit of Yale. But let me come back to the 1890s and 1920s. What else was going on in America that these immigrants, Southern Italian immigrants especially, confronted? Well, lynching throughout the South. Especially the 11 in New Orleans, 47 more Southern Italian lynchings were recorded throughout the South. Teddy Roosevelt, then commissioner of police in New York City, said of the New Orleans lynching, it was, quote, rather a good thing, unquote. It was praised in New Haven by the local newspapers. No one was ever held responsible for it. Italian immigrant organizations throughout the nation criticized it. We are law-abiding. We need the law to protect us, they said. But it was the beginning of an education. What emerged were questions. How do we stop the discrimination against Catholics, against Southern Italians? Does the law really matter? In August 1920, a vicious attack occurred, and the destruction and burning of an Italian immigrant neighborhood occurred in West Frankfort, Illinois. The Italians fought back. 500 state troopers were called out to quell the fighting. The Northern Italian government was largely uninterested. Voting restrictions became more severe. Literary tests used in Massachusetts were introduced by Senator Henry Cabot Lodge to stop Italian immigrants from voting. Those tests became models for what was then used in the South. Only Pope Leo XIII came to the aid of the immigrants. Sister Mary Xavier Cabrini was sent to America, and the Pope issued his encyclical on Catholic social teaching. He issued another encyclical against eugenics. He wasn't critical about childbirth. He was critical of the failure of the United States government to protect immigrants, Catholics, and the poor. They had failed in their duty. So we come to 1919 and 1920. The United States Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer organized raids into homes and labor halls, primarily in the Northeast and the Midwest, without warrants or court approval. Palmer and others saw it as ridding the nation of people critical of capitalism as it was then practiced, the exploitation of workers, and the elevation of white Anglo-Saxon Protestants as the dominant model citizens. A federal judge called the raids the terrorism of a mob. Upton Sinclair called it, tellingly, white terror. Italian immigrants were the primary focus, especially women who led strikes in the garment industry or to protect their husbands and sons from industrial accidents. Finally, we get to May 5th, 1920, and our reason for being here, the arrest of Sacco and Vanzetti. But before that, in 1911, Congress, the United States Congress, at the behest of eugenics supporters, especially at Yale, began studies to show the genetic inferiority of Southern Italians. At this juncture, the National Office of the American Eugenics Society was established in New Haven. Its research funded by Carnegie. Eugenics was supported in Good Housekeeping and Saturday Evening Post, by presidents, the American military, by Charles Lindbergh, by Protestant clergy. Southern Italians were denigrated, shamed, including their children. The law, once again, was used to justify discrimination. The Immigration Act of 1924 was the product to largely prohibit immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe in favor of the census distribution in 1890. Northern Europeans were favored. That law was not changed until the 1960s. This was not just about numbers or geography. It was about imposing fear, humiliation, shame. It was about saying, you are not worthy. We had not yet been able to stop the discrimination. This was the setting then on May 5th, 1920, when Sacco and Vanzetti were arrested.
Thank you. So for those who may not be familiar with the Sacco and Vanzetti case, Can you share a little bit of background with us?
Yes, I can. It is, as you know, from your own experience, a long and complex history. And I'm going to try and do that in a summary form. And as long as the audience appreciates, it's just a summary and not intended to in any way replace the complexity of it, although it has some startling clarity to it. Let's start with who were these two men. Nicola Sacco was born in Torre Maggiore in the southeastern part of Italy in 1891. His family was highly regarded. They were primarily farmers. He arrived in Boston in 1908 with his brother. He was 17 years old. He took courses and apprenticed as a shoemaker and developed a very prudent lifestyle. He was praised by his employer for his skill and his commitment to helping other employees. He also served periodically as a night watchman in the same company. For that purpose, he was required to own a handgun. He was politically active. He and his wife, Rosina, engaged in fundraising activities to aid workers and their families, and often joined picket lines in support of fair treatment. He was arrested once in doing so, but the arrest appears to have been dismissed on appeal. He later was strongly opposed to the rise of fascism and Mussolini in Italy. He and Rosina had a son, Dante. That's a great photograph that you have up. It's actually the photograph that becomes quite consequential, as I'll describe in a moment. Because his correspondence later showed, his father was ill and his mother sought his return. He and Rosina and Dante were preparing to return to Torre Maggiore. He was 29 when he was arrested. Also, Rosina was pregnant with their second child. Bartolomeo Vanzetti was born in 1888 in the picturesque village of Villa Folletto, south of Turin. He attended school and was quite literate and well-read. His mother, with whom he was very close, died young of cancer. He also was close to his sister, Luisa, who later is a very central thread in this story. He immigrated after his mother's death. He was 20 years old when he entered Ellis Island in 1908. He traveled extensively in New York, Connecticut, Missouri, Ohio, and Pennsylvania, usually to centers of industrial labor activities. He settled near Plymouth, Massachusetts, largely for his health. He worked outdoors as a fish peddler. His political beliefs, and eventually his anti-fascism, was similar to Sacco's. He too had never been arrested. Vanzetti owned a handgun because there had been documented attempted robberies in his neighborhood, and he carried cash for his business. Owning handguns was not illegal. Vanzetti also had collected shotgun shells, although he did not own a shotgun. Neither Sacco nor Vanzetti had ever driven a car. It's unclear they saw much of each other. Their lifestyles and geographic locations were quite different. Both, however, were in possession of the kind of literature that Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer considered radical and anti-capitalist. So too did others they knew. Both were well informed of what the government was doing to repress, arrest, jail, or deport those who held such beliefs. Anarchism was among those beliefs. That is, less government and more social consciousness about workers, not violence. And as you'll hear shortly, the United States Department of Justice agreed with that understanding. On May 5th, 1920, Sacco and Vanzetti visited the boarding house where a person lived who they were told owned a car and would help them collect and dispose of the literature owned by friends, as well as their own guns and shells. The car was a 6-year-old Overland. He was not home. The two left on a trolley. the police were focused not on Sacco and Vanzetti, but on the car. They were arrested. And it turned out that the Overland car was never connected to any crime. They were not told when they were arrested why they were arrested until many hours later. They denied being radicals out of fear. That is, as best they could understand the questions at all. They acknowledged they hoped to collect literature from people they knew in 5 or 6 towns and hide or destroy it. These first moments would later prove enormously consequential. There are 2 crimes, and keep in mind this May 5th, 1920 date. The first crime was on December 24th, 1919, Christmas Eve, early morning, in Bridgewater, Massachusetts. The attempted failed robbery of a shoe company payroll, which included a shotgun allegedly being fired. 3 men were in a car, 1 got out and back in. The second crime was on April 15th, 1920, in South Braintree, Massachusetts. Another shoe company, Slater and Morrill. This time, the robbery was successful. $15,000, 5 men committed the robbery and drove off in a car. 2 guards were shot and killed. Sacco was at work on December 24th and had clocked in. He had what might be called an American alibi. Vanzetti was miles from the crime scene in Plymouth, selling eels. Vanzetti was indicted for the December 24th crime. No one else. There were 2 trials. The first trial for the Bridgewater crime began on June the 22nd, 1920, and it ended on July 1st, 1920. It was called the dress rehearsal, more perhaps like the essential strategic prerequisite. Normal prosecutorial conduct would have been to try Vanzetti for the more serious crime first, which makes it unnecessary to try him for the lesser crime. Not here. The evidence against Sacco for the South Braintree crime, the second one, was so weak, it was believed that the prosecutor needed Sacco to be tried with a felon, Vanzetti. The judge who lobbied for the appointment was Webster Thayer, the quintessential white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, the Boston Brahmin type. He'd gone to Dartmouth. Frederick Katzman was the prosecutor. The trial was about patriotism. And Thayer made that clear from his opening remarks to the jury. Here is some of what happened during that trial. The prosecutor's witnesses who couldn't identify Vanzetti after he was arrested became precise eyewitnesses a few months later. One witness claimed Vanzetti spoke perfect English and was the driver. Another witness recognized him, he said, by the way he ran, quote, like an Italian, unquote. Both required the prosecutor's aid in clarifying their testimony, but the testimony of both was admitted. The Pinkerton Detective Agency had performed a written investigation and detailed report immediately after the crime. They found no spent shotgun casing, or even evidence a shotgun had been fired. All possible witnesses also were interviewed. None described anyone who looked like Vanzetti. A passerby witness showed up with 1 spent shotgun casing, having held it since December of the previous year and mixed it with others he owned. The chain of evidence was completely broken. It didn't matter. It was admitted as similar to the shotgun shells taken from Vanzetti. The prosecutor's car evidence. Witnesses who were interviewed by Pinkerton at the crime scene described the car to be a Hudson or an Overland. That's why an Overland car was a subject of suspicion on May 5th, 1920. However, a Buick had been reported stolen, allegedly used in the crime, and recovered. By the trial, the same witnesses turned the car into a Buick. The police never fingerprinted the Buick or in any way connected it to Vanzetti. It didn't matter. The Pinkerton report was known only to the prosecutors. It was not made known to Vanzetti's lawyers until 1927. Vanzetti had 14 alibi witnesses. They placed him in Plymouth, miles away, selling eels for their Christmas Eve dinner. They were Italian immigrants, mostly women, and many needed a translator. They were ridiculed openly. To his landlady, who testified that Vanzetti was up very early and selling fish the morning of the crime. The prosecutor asked her, what time did he get up on the first day of the year? What time did he go to bed on Washington's birthday of this year? Do you know what a balboni is? That is something you hang out on the line on wash day, isn't it? Vanzetti's lawyer became a law partner of the prosecutor's brother right after the trial ended. And there were no Italian Americans on the jury. Vanzetti was found guilty on July 1st, 1920. He was sentenced almost immediately to 15 years in prison. Sacco and Vanzetti were then indicted on September 11th, 1920 for the second crime in South Braintree. No one else was indicted. By the second trial, Vanzetti was a felon, chained, and his felony was well known. Webster Thayer served again as judge, Katzman as prosecutor. In Massachusetts at the time, the defendants were placed behind a caged enclosure and also not next to their lawyers. Rifled policemen were inside and outside the courtroom. The setting alone was prejudicial. Also, before the second trial began, the head of the Massachusetts State Police thought that Sacco and Vanzetti were innocent. He was temporarily taken off the case. Also before the second trial began, and to this day, despite multiple Pinkerton, FBI, and police efforts and searches in New York, Massachusetts, on ships, and in Italy, the stolen money was never recovered. No connection in any form was made between the money stolen and the conduct or the savings of either man. Also before the second trial began, the United States Department of Justice internal report shared with the prosecutor stated that although both men believed in anarchism, quote, I do not mean necessarily that they were inclined to violence. What I mean is that I think they did not believe in organized government or in private property. But I am also thoroughly convinced, and I believe that it is and always has been the opinion of such Boston agents of the Department of Justice that these men had nothing whatever to do with the South Braintree murders, and that the South Braintree crime was committed by a gang of professional highwaymen, unquote. The Department of Justice report was not shared with the defense lawyers until 1927. Also from the outset of both trials, Italian and Jewish immigrants organized a defense committee located in the north end of Boston. They began to raise money throughout the country. In 2019 dollars, the total raised in 7 years was the equivalent of $4,600,000. A majority, nickels, dimes, quarters, and dollars, including from food sales, plays, and musical performances, came from Italian immigrants.
You might be interested to know, Neil, that here in Los Angeles, in the building where the Italian American Museum is located, a local chapter of the Sacco and Vanzetti Defense Committee met and raised money and organized on behalf of the men's defense.
I appreciate you saying that. It's an excellent example, Mariana, of precisely what went on throughout the country. Italian immigrants in some oblique places you would not even think about, but certainly in places like Los Angeles, came together and raised money. And it was quite an awesome thing when I read it, and I tried to really calculate just how much had been raised by these immigrants. But also at the outset of the second trial,
Mhm.
Men and women in Boston were angered by the judge's conduct. Two in particular, Elizabeth Glendower Evans, whose husband was a friend of United States Supreme Court Justice Louis Brandeis, and Gardner Jackson, a newspaper writer from Colorado, who joined the Defense Committee. And there were growing interest among groups like the newly formed American Civil Liberties Union, Nation Magazine, the New Republic, and faculty from colleges and universities throughout the nation. The dynamics and the visibility of the prosecution of Sacco and Vanzetti was changing. Now, the second trial. It began May 31st, 1921, the day after Memorial Day, through July 14th, 1921, in Dedham, Massachusetts. On the jury, there was not a single Italian American. The lawyers. Fred Moore represented Sacco. He was inexpensive and hired by the Defense Committee. He was a California lawyer who represented radical labor leaders. He was not a member of the Massachusetts bar. He was not thorough. His purpose was political. He wanted to put political beliefs foremost on trial. He and Sacco argued constantly. Sacco and his wife wanted to be free, not to have Sacco become a martyr. At the conclusion of the trial, Moore was fired by Sacco. Vanzetti's lawyer was decent, local, neither aggressive nor thorough, certainly not willing to take on Katzman or Judge Thayer or look un-American. Moore dominated the trial and the strategy. Witnesses. 59 witnesses were called by the prosecutor, 99 for Sacco and Vanzetti. The prosecutor's witnesses hadn't identified Sacco and Vanzetti at the police station as being at the crime scene. One witness who saw the moving getaway car from a second floor window 60 feet away and for somewhere between 1 and 4 seconds at the trial was now able to describe Sacco's hair color, weight, eyebrows, and the size of his left hand. 5 other witnesses who had been with her called her a liar. None of the 5 could identify Sacco. Her testimony was admitted. Sacco had alibi witnesses. He was at the Italian consulate that day applying for a passport. It's the photograph, Mariana, you showed a few moments ago. Mm-hmm. That was the one he brought with him. They remembered it because it was so large. Testimony to support that fact was provided by Italian consulate officials. And then friends of Vanzetti's, of Sacco's, with whom he ate lunch later that day. Of course, they were all Italians. Vanzetti's alibi witness, women, Italian women, who bought fish from him in North Plymouth that day. As in the first trial, they were ridiculed, and they were actually made to seem prejudiced. That is, they would testify only in support of an Italian. Mm. The bullet. Strenuous efforts were made to connect one of the bullets taken from the bodies of the 2 guards to Sacco's gun. Oddly, it was the only bullet that was completely different than all the others that had been removed. This I couldn't possibly summarize. None of these bullets had a clear, unadulterated path to the trial. This one bullet, again different from the others, and Sacco's gun were never protected from transfer and usage by different people, sometimes lost, the gun once completely disassembled by a private party, and all regularly mislabeled. The state police chief, when he did finally testify, said that this one bullet was, quote, consistent, unquote, with coming from Sacco's gun. The judge repeated his testimony immediately to the jury that it was the bullet and that it actually came from Sacco's gun. The chief of police later recanted and clarified his testimony, but not until 1927. Mm-hmm. Both Sacco and Vanzetti testified. The question was mostly about their political beliefs. The trial was about patriotism. Also, keep in mind, neither Sacco nor Vanzetti spoke or understood English with fluency. But they needed now to explain to the jury why they reacted cautiously when arrested. It was a fruitless effort. It was exploited by the judge and the prosecutor. On July 21st, 1921, both were found guilty of robbery and murder, but not yet sentenced.
So, you have a judge, Webster Thayer, who has a clear dislike for foreigners. He asked, after presiding over the first trial, he asked to be put on the second trial. He later refers to Sacco and Vanzetti as, quote, anarchist bastards. You have police work that's questionable, to say the least. Was this as reprehensible as it sounds? Was this common for the era? I mean, you said the trial was about patriotism. Clearly, there's this desire to make an example out of Sacco and Vanzetti. But it just seems like, this is as plain as the nose on one's face. And a lot of Americans recognize that. People across the world recognize that. It just seems so hard to imagine that, well, it really was, just that much of a miscarriage of justice as it's been described for decades. It makes you want to, 100 years later, jump up and down and scream.
You're not only correct about all of that, but let me go back to something I was trying to describe at the beginning. And Webster Thayer is a classic example of it, or a product of it. The white Anglo-Saxon Protestant condescension, the arrogance of it, the superiority of it, you can only be who we are to be accepted. We are the model, and they believed it. And no one else could fit into that category. So that the depth of that, the mentality, and then you had, and you see it all over, you saw it all over the country in these eugenics laws, but you saw it in other ways as well, including here. That is, they had control of the law. And so the point that I was trying to make before, and that Italian Americans, Italian immigrants especially, came to appreciate. It wasn't all that different than what they had experienced in Italy. And the reason they left, that the law wasn't about fairness. Power is what determined justice. And the law got used to serve that purpose. It certainly did here, and it did many other places. But these eugenics laws, which are in effect at this time, in 30 states in the United States. And I'm going to get to precisely the timing of when the eugenics laws finally reached the Supreme Court of the United States and were affirmed, upheld. And I'll come to that because it's part of this story.
Okay. So now can we discuss a bit about the reaction to the verdicts, or do we want to, is there more that you'd like to include about?
Well, a little bit more about, well, no, this is sort of about the reaction. It's the appeals. It's then what came next. And this is consequential, and it may be to your colleagues in Pittsburgh. The Italian women and men, the organization.
Italian Sons and Daughters of America.
Yeah, actually organized, and their home is in Pittsburgh. In 1922 and 1923, a distinguished member of the bar, William Thompson, and I saw you had his photograph up a few moments ago, who was also deeply angered at Thayer's conduct, agreed to take over the case and represent both men. Two other lawyers also volunteered, Herbert Ehrman, who became the chief investigator, and Michael Angelo Musmana, a young lawyer from Pittsburgh, whose father was a coal miner and encouraged his son to come. Musmano also spoke Italian, could communicate easily with both men and with Sacco's wife and son, and as we'll see, with Vanzetti's sister, Luigia. Musmano also brought with him a petition from the National Sons of Italy in America seeking fairness for Sacco and Vanzetti. It's worth noting as a footnote that Musmano later became a rear admiral in World War II, a judge at the Nuremberg United States Military Tribunal, a member of the Pennsylvania Supreme Court, and a lifelong advocate for the innocence of Sacco and Vanzetti. He's buried at Arlington National Cemetery. His papers are at Duquesne University in Pittsburgh. Collectively, this new involvement and the crystallization of increased recognition within universities and newspapers of the unfairness that you described with great clarity before began a dramatic, powerful cultural change. Along with Italian and Jewish immigrants, labor leaders, and social organizations, this determined force dedicated to fairness, law, and justice was projected strongly throughout the nation. There were 6 appeals. Under Massachusetts law, they all were handled and denied by the same judge, Webster Thayer. One major reason the case languished so long wasn't the timing of the appeals, but the long time Thayer took in rendering decisions. The defense wanted a new trial and a different judge. Here are a few of the reasons, or the bases for some of these appeals. Again, under Massachusetts law, they went to the same judge. The eyewitnesses against Sacco and Vanzetti were all discredited in time. They lied, took bribes, one was under an arrest warrant. When finally Thayer recognized the eyewitnesses for the prosecution had no credibility, he said it didn't matter. Sacco and Vanzetti had, quote, displayed consciousness of guilt when arrested, unquote. Thayer's prejudice was bold and public. Outside the courtroom, he said, they ought to hang them anyway. And as you mentioned a few moments ago, did you see what I did to those anarchist bastards? He concluded that none of his inside or outside the courtroom statements mattered or reflected any prejudice. The United States Department of Justice report that I referenced earlier was finally disclosed. When the report was given to the lawyers, they requested that all the files within the Department of Justice concerning Sacco and Vanzetti be released. The Attorney General of the United States refused, and Judge Thayer refused to lend credence to the report or agree it should be released, or that it even mattered. Celestine Medeiros, a young man convicted of a different crime, confessed to the South Braintree crime, undertaken, he said, with a Providence gang whose leader looked almost identical to Sacco. Sacco, he said, was never involved. Judge Thayer just didn't believe him. The Massachusetts Supreme Court had limited authority and refused to overrule Thayer for his conduct or his rulings. It could have, but it didn't. This mentality, this imperative, this fear of Italian immigrants was very powerful among people who had power. The governor, Alvin Fuller, was asked for a pardon. He created an extraordinarily prejudiced commission of 3 to re-examine the trial evidence and the judge's conduct. The committee was chaired by A. Lawrence Lowell, the president of Harvard. He was a well-known advocate for eugenics, and he was a member of an anti-immigration society. We also learned a few years ago that the committee's decision was actually written before the evidence was completely presented. The commission unanimously upheld all of Webster Thayer's conclusions. On April 9th, 1927, both men were sentenced to death. Between then and August the 23rd, on 5 occasions, US Supreme Court justices denied stays of the execution, 3 by Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes. Now, In this same term, at almost the exact same time, a case reaches the United States Supreme Court. It was called Buck versus Bell. Carrie Buck was in an institution in Virginia. She had been institutionalized and they wanted to sterilize her. She had given birth to a child out of wedlock. They concluded the child was an imbecile. They concluded Carrie Buck was an imbecile. They concluded Carrie Buck's mother was an imbecile. This gave rise to a decision 8-1, written by Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, who was himself a committed, well-known eugenicist. He concluded, this is this famous line about 3 generations of imbeciles are enough. Yeah. And he writes that decision at the exact same time as he denies the stays of the execution of Sacco and Vanzetti. There were national and global demonstrations almost immediately, and there were very saddened vigils in Italian immigrant neighborhoods all over the nation. There were demonstrations in Buenos Aires, New Delhi, Cape Town, Cairo, Toronto, Paris, Brussels, Berlin, London, and multiple cities in the United States, including Boston, New York, San Francisco, Los Angeles, and New Haven, Connecticut. Support against the execution came from Madame Curie, Anatole France, Alfred Dreyfus, H.L. Mencken, multiple lawyers and university faculties, Harvard historian Arthur Schlesinger, law professors Felix Frankfurter and William O. Douglas, both of whom later became Supreme Court justices, and elected officials, multiple literary figures, and prominent newspaper writers.
I'll add Albert Einstein to the list.
Yes, thank you. It didn't matter. They were electrocuted on August 23rd, 1927.
I think the first time I learned about this case, I was in elementary school, and it struck me then and it strikes me now. And the more I read about it, the angrier I get. And the sadder I become. I think on some level, Sacco and Vanzetti, they kind of embody, our relatives, our grandparents, the people who, arrived here and whose struggles made our lives possible. And I think that's why there's such an emotional connection for me. So here we have 2 men, put to death after there's, no evidence to convict them for the crimes that they were charged with, and a judge that says it doesn't matter. We've spoken a lot about Sacco and Vanzetti. Let's talk a little bit about 2 of the figures who are often overlooked in, this case and the ordeal. Rosina Sacco and Luigi Vanzetti.
I'm going to read a paragraph, and it's from Michael Angelo Musmano. He describes a visit to Governor Alvin Fuller. And I'm going to read this this is out of my book, Fearless. And once I do this, and it's all I'm going to say about the 2 of them because I think it's very powerful. Luigi Vanzetti came to America to see her brother. And once I do this, let's come back to Sacco and Vanzetti briefly, because I want to talk a bit about, before we get off of them in this framework, about their own writings. This is out of the book. Ringing persistently into the soul of parents of Italian-American children were Vanzetti's closing words in court. Quote, "I have suffered because I was an Italian, and indeed I am an Italian," unquote. Resounding permanently in the still moments in Italian-American households was the last plea made by Rosina Sacco and Luigi Vanzetti to Governor Alvin Fuller in his chambers in the Boston State House, only hours before the scheduled execution. Musmano was with them. Quote, "In Italy, we look upon America as a land of mercy," Musmano later recounted Luigi Vanzetti telling the governor. "And you have the power of mercy. And will you not extend that mercy for these two tortured men who have already suffered 7 long years? Imagine how my heart was cut to pieces when after 19 years I saw my Bartow so weak. Has this great good government of America not tortured him enough already? On my knees, O governor." And she knelt down on the floor before him. "I implore you, do not let America become known as the land of cruelty. I beg you for mercy, mercy, mercy." With rosary beads in her uplifted hands, as tears flowed to the carpet under her knees, Miss Vanzetti prayed to Fuller for pity. It didn't matter. Musmano recited the closing moment. Mrs. Sacco, quivering, lent a trembling hand. I took Miss Vanzetti's other arm, and the 3 of us stumbled from the room.
Mm.
Let me stick with these 2 women for a moment, but I then want to go back to Sacco and Vanzetti and some of their writings, because I think you should hear them.
And we have images of some of them.
Yes. The courage of these 2 women, especially Sacco, Mrs. Sacco, Rosina Sacco, that they had to withstand this daily. She had to raise 2 children, was quite a remarkable thing to watch, to see, to learn about. And it runs deep into the notion of Italian women, Italian immigrant women, and the powerful role they played, not only in the conventional sense of keeping a family together, but in enduring hardship for that family and knowing how to ensure they could somehow survive in America, survive in this kind of a setting. So she is in her way a model, and so is Luigi Vanzetti. So I think that the attention to these women needs to be stronger and more vividly portrayed than it has been. There are lessons there. Mm-hmm. Let me go to the writing, just a bit of this, of the words of Sacco and Vanzetti, because I think they're important. They were taught, and they also learned English by the women, like Elizabeth Glendower Evans, who brought them books and magazines daily. Vanzetti was able to expand his literary knowledge and skill considerably. And do keep in mind that these 2 men were not in the same jail. They were not near each other through most of the 7-year time period. The writing and oratory of the 2 of them was, for me, a sad and actually powerfully enlightening revelation. It also was a source of disappointment. When I was reading these, I was in my 40s. Why didn't I know it? Why wasn't it taught? Why was it not shared among Italian immigrants and Italian Americans, let alone in the public schools? I'm going to start with Vanzetti. Toward the end of his time in prison, he made the following comment to Philip Strong, a newspaper reporter, who wrote it down. If it had not been for these things, I might have lived out my life talking out street corners to scorning men. I might have died, unmarked, unknown, a failure. Now we are not a failure. This is our career and our triumph. Never in our full life can we hope to do such work for tolerance, for justice, for man's understanding of man, as now we do by an accident. Our words, our lives, our pains, nothing. The taking of our lives, lives of a good shoemaker and a poor fish peddler, all. That last moment belonged to us. That agony is our triumph. Upton Sinclair, in his book Boston, published the following year in 1928, wrote this about Vanzetti's words. that I just read to you. Pass on, Bartolomeo Vanzetti. Your work is done. You have spoken the noblest words heard in America in the 2 generations since Abraham Lincoln died. I heard that comparison a second time in a 1947 movie starring Henry Fonda, The Male Animal, and I'll describe it to you later. But to Sacco. At the end, Sacco wrote letters to his 2 children. To his daughter Inez, who was 5 or 6 years old at the time, and had sent him a letter. This is an excerpt from Sacco's last letter to his daughter, dated July 19th, 1927. You have it in front of you. Mm-hmm. Quote, I'm just going to read a bit of it. I am going to try from the bottom of my heart to make you understand how dear you are to your father's soul. If I cannot succeed in doing that, I know that you will save this letter and read it over in future years to come. You will see and feel the same heartfelt affection as your father feels in writing it to you. I will bring with me your little and so dearest letter and carry it right under my heart in the last day of my life. When I die, it will be buried with your father who loves you so much, as I do your brother Dante and holy dear mother. To his son Dante, this is dated August 18th, 1927. It's just an excerpt. Well, my dear boy, after your mother had talked to me so much, and I had dreamed of you day and night, how joyful it was to see you at last, to have talked to you like we used to in those days. Much I told you on that visit and more I wanted to say, but I saw that you will remain the same affectionate boy, faithful to your mother who loves you so much. But don't cry, Dante, because many tears have been wasted for 7 years and never did any good. So, son, instead of crying, be strong, so as to be able to comfort your mother. And when you want to distract her from the discouraging soulless, I will tell you what I used to do. To take her for a long walk in a quiet country, gathering wildflowers here and there, resting under the shade of trees. And I am sure that she will enjoy this very much, as you surely would be happy for it. But remember always, Dante, in the play of happiness, don't use all for yourself only, but down yourself just one step at your side and help the weak ones that cry for help. Help the prosecuted and the victim, because they are your better friends. In this struggle for life, you will find more love and you will be loved. Sacco's letter to Dante was selected for inclusion in A Treasury of the World's Greatest Letters, published in 1940. Vanzetti wrote a letter to Dante as well, dated August 21st, 1927. Here's an excerpt from it, just a short paragraph. I tell you now that all I know of your father, he is not a criminal, but one of the bravest men I ever knew. Someday you will understand what I am about to tell you, that your father has sacrificed everything dear and sacred in the human heart and soul for his faith in liberty and justice for all. That day you will be proud of your father. And if you become brave place in the struggle between tyranny and liberty. Vanzetti's letter to Dante was included in Letters of the Century, America, 1900 to 1999, published by Random House.
So why do you think this case remains so important a century later? I often cite it as one that has affected Italian-American identity that Italian-Americans themselves aren't even necessarily aware. And what do you think its lasting impact has been on the nation as a whole?
I think it's been enormously consequential, and perhaps in ways many Italian Americans don't fully appreciate. And I'm going to get to that. Let me start with some other effects that precede this, that happened immediately and had a long life and still do. There was an enormous amount of art, literature, plays, movies, folk music, and television programs that came from the lives and execution of both men. You have on the screen now Ben Shaw's paintings. They were among them. There were 140 poems written, including one that was actually recorded by Edna St. Vincent Millay. 7 plays and movies. One starred Burgess Meredith as the Vanzetti character. The 1947 movie that I alluded to earlier, The Male Animal with Henry Fonda. This was the era when Fonda starred as Tom Joad in The Grapes of Wrath. In The Male Animal, he's an associate professor, Tommy Turner, at a Midwestern university, who unassumingly shares with another faculty member that he intends to lecture students on the eloquent use of words by non-professional writers. He selects Abraham Lincoln and Bartolomeo Vanzetti. He's threatened with dismissal by the Board of Trustees if he utters the words of someone so un-American. Eventually, Turner, Fonda, defies the prohibition. He reads the words I read to you earlier, while members of the Board of Trustees enter and sit in the lecture hall. To their delight, they find the words inoffensive. Then there are Ben Shahn paintings, and you have 2 in front of you. They're gouaches, as they're called, up in the nature of watercolors. He did a large mural for Syracuse University. That's it, which is still on display. The 1960 television production, a 2-part production of Sacco and Vanzetti, was directed by Sidney Lumet and starred, and I hope I don't age myself too much here, Martin Balsam as Sacco, and Stephen Hill, who played the prosecutor, the chief prosecutor in Law and Order. He played Vanzetti. In 1977, Massachusetts Governor Michael Dukakis issued a proclamation. It's quite eloquent. It led to great controversy. He read it in the Boston State House. He wrote in part, "To prevent the forces of intolerance, fear, and hatred from ever again uniting to overcome the rationality, wisdom, and fairness to which our legal system aspires." The proclamation was dedicated to the manner in which Boston unfairly and the judicial system unfairly treated Sacco and Vanzetti. The American Bar Association conducted a retrial of the Sacco and Vanzetti case. And each of the lawyers involved, all prosecutors, concluded that as prosecutors, not enough credible evidence existed to even indict either man for any crime. There's the 1971 movie, Sacco and Vanzetti, made in Italy, with stirring music by Joan Baez. It's quite an awesome movie. It is very accurate. I've seen it many times. I couldn't recommend it highly enough. Then there is Gutson Borglum. He was the originator of Mount Rushmore, the original sculptor. He did this bas relief plaque that you have on, that you're currently showing. In 1937, 1947, and 1957, that plaque was offered to the mayor of Boston or the governor of Massachusetts and rejected. I believe that all that survives, which you have in front of you, is the actual size original plastic mold. In 1997, at a ceremony at the Boston Public Library, which I attended, the plaque was formally accepted by Boston Mayor Thomas Menino and Governor Paul Cellucci. There was still controversy that day. There also is a very moving musical drama out of Belgium. It was revised and staged in New Haven's Schubert Theater in 2002. It was done in Belgium because there was a great controversy about immigration. And the 2 leading a playwright and composer, were asked to come up with an idea to deal with this subject, and they came up with the story of Sacco and Vanzetti. I was involved in the revision of it and staging it at the New Haven Schubert Theater in 2002. But let's come back to the broader effect. It was during this time, in 1997 especially, that I came to appreciate that the focus in most settings was largely upon the legal meaning of the controversy, or a discussion of the political tenor at the time. That is, the controversy was somehow locked in time, as if it had a beginning and an end. Well, that was not my interest. Too much was unexplored. The deeper cultural and value-driven effect on Italian immigrants and other Southern and Eastern European immigrants, or those wanting to come to America who knew about these events, had not been really examined. And the controversy over Sacco and Vanzetti, and I alluded to this earlier in describing the political views of Sacco and Vanzetti, took place at the time of another very consequential and very divisive event, the rise of fascism and Mussolini. They were strongly embraced, both the concept and idea of fascism and Mussolini, strongly embraced financially and politically by the nation's major banks, by its major foundations like Carnegie and Rockefeller, and Yale University. What did that mean for Italian immigrants and Italian Americans? Still confronted by lynching, by eugenics, by voting restrictions, by immigration restrictions, and now the death of Sacco and Vanzetti. And all of that discrimination was legitimized in the law. You still come to, how do you stop the discrimination? In 1997, after the Boston event, myself and others organized a day-long symposium at the Yale Law School. And again in 2002, a year-long commemoration in New Haven, which is where I'm from. We embraced a much fuller and deeper analysis. New original works and poetry were performed. The Ben Shahn paintings were shown. The musical drama I mentioned was also performed. It brought new people and new institutions and a deeper, different look at an old story that was actually very current. So here is what I came to appreciate. The depth of fear and repression, the denial of jobs and educational opportunities, the continued discrimination yielded an apprehension to talk about it. Italian immigrants, mothers and fathers, did not want to pass it on. They didn't want their children to run the risk of having to deal with it in settings other than home. They largely prohibited, and they prohibited public discussion. I came across one setting where the mother of a member of Congress, Rosa DeLauro, who's actually Italian-American. As a child, her parents took away her scrapbook of Sacco and Vanzetti articles. They threw it out. They didn't want her to keep it. I heard the same kinds of stories from my own relatives and others during the course of this 2001 event. I found that Italian-Americans were the least informed about much of what I discussed, all of tonight, not just Sacco and Vanzetti. That their knowledge of models, heroes among men and women of their own heritage, going back to Northern Italian bigotry and repression, to the resistance fighters, the women resistance fighters for independence and democracy, the women garment workers for fairness, that knowledge was very narrow and non-existent. So how do you stop the discrimination? This was the question they were confronted with. How do you be a good American? And you alluded to this, Mariana, almost at the beginning. How do you be a good American when the law didn't matter? And power and who had it and who crafted the law determined justice? And how do you answer those two questions and still retain the values and identity and neighborhoods you wanted in order to live safely, enjoy your culture, and to raise children? It's what made the history of eugenics and the discriminatory, ugly history of urban renewal so consequential to me when I found it so boldly embraced and selfishly exploited at Yale in the Giamatti book that I wrote. There was a mentality. It was deep and it persisted and it affected all of us. So what emerges out of this, especially in the, to me, what emerges out of this, especially in the post Sacco and Vanzetti Mussolini era, in that time period, is a divide. There's a divide among Italian Americans, and this is when it began. Two broad categories emerged. Those who moved towards what I'm going to call labor, broadly defined, like women in the needle trade or men and women entering politics, versus those who moved towards what I'm going to call the country club, broadly defined, more disconnected from the past, actually, more committed to embracing institutions whose values reflected white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. It was the same question. How do you become a good American? You can see the differences today. Think about it. Justice Antonin Scalia versus Mario Cuomo. Justice Samuel Alito versus Geraldine Ferraro or Nancy Pelosi. You might even see it between Robert De Niro versus Alan Alda, the kinds of movies they made and who they were intended to serve. A divide exists. I think this is when it began, and it's a divide among Italian Americans, and it still plays out. And now I am open for questions.
Okay, well, thank you for first, if we were live as we're accustomed to being at the museum with, people who we can reach out and shake hands and interact as we enjoy so much doing as Italian Americans, and of course everyone else who attends our programs as well. I would leave this moment for applause. But we applaud you for the fantastic presentation, and we do have a few questions. One of the first was, we saw the Italian government intervene after the lynching of 11 Italian Americans in New Orleans. As many of our listeners know, there was in fact a diplomatic crisis that ensued after the United States government failed to hold the perpetrators of the lynching accountable. So the question is, what role did the Italian government play, if any, in the Sacco and Vanzetti case? Did it attempt to intervene on the men's behalf?
No, not until the very end, under a lot of pressure. Mussolini made a contact with the governor. It was done quietly. And when the governor politely told him to that he wasn't going to change his view, he withdrew. Mussolini withdrew. You want to keep in mind that and New Haven is a good example of this, but I saw it elsewhere. And Sacco and Vanzetti were, of course, vehemently anti-fascist, and so were the people who supported him on the Defense Committee. That Mussolini really struggled with how to convince Italian immigrants in the United States, who were here in great numbers, and new Italian Americans, how to convince them not to oppose his form of fascism. And so he made very consequential efforts to do that. In the end, they didn't succeed, but in some settings, they did. There are some communities, and not all Italian Americans responded the same way. In New Haven, there were anti-fascist demonstrations and riots led by Italian Americans. In other communities, it was very different. But so the short answer is not much and late.
Okay, our next question is kind of a long one. So try to follow me here. One of the viewers says, when I saw a lecture in 1997 on Sacco and Vanzetti as part of the lost world of Italian-American radicalism, I realized the Sacco and Vanzetti case was the trial of the century, partially because unlike Pearl Harbor, the JFK assassination, and the Space Shuttle Challenger incident, where people asked, where were you when it happened? In the case of Sacco and Vanzetti, you can imagine people asking others, what did you do at midnight to cope with knowing that Sacco and Vanzetti were going to be executed? Popular culture has identified other trials as the trials of the century. The same person says, I saw an author discussing the Scopes trial, which also took place in the 1920s and is, obviously it's popularly known as the monkey trial, and examined was surrounding the teaching of evolution. The Scopes trial was often referred to as a trial of the century, but this person was clearly oblivious to the Sacco and Vanzetti trial and that it was happening in the same decade. So here's a question. In an age where people are asked to understand the history and culture of other groups, and knowing that a case can be made that of all historical white ethnic groups in America, Italians had to overcome the most challenges within the American experience. Do you see more being done to educate people as to why the Sacco and Vanzetti case is indeed the trial of the century?
Would you repeat just the last part of that sentence?
Yes, and I'm sorry, it was kind of a lots of lead up, but
okay, I got the lead up. I understood that.
Okay, so in an age where people are asked to understand the history and culture of other groups, and knowing that a case can be made that out of all, basically saying that out of all the historic white ethnic groups in America, Italians historically had to overcome the most challenges within the American experience, period. Do you see more being done, or what should be done, to educate people as to why the Sacco and Vanzetti case is in fact the trial of the century?
There are two answers to that.
Yes.
One's quite personal,
yes.
And that is, I not only agree with that, but in 2000, that more can or should be done. Mm-hmm. In 2002, that's precisely what myself and others in New Haven, Connecticut did. That is, I was in Washington, D.C. at the time, practicing law, teaching. And a few years before, when I attended this event in Boston, I really came away with this feeling that I described to you. My sense that there was a much bigger story here that was not being explored, that Sacco and Vanzetti were far more current, far more consequential to Italian Americans and in the Italian experience in America, but to many others, many other immigrant groups, many other people cared about it, wanted to know about it, and didn't know enough. And so I went to New Haven and I got the mayor, who was Italian American, John DeStefano, and the Congresswoman, Rosa DeLaura, in a room with members of all the arts and theater and cultural groups in New Haven. And I said, this is what I would like to do. And they all agreed to do it. And there was the New Haven Public Library got the masks, the death masks of both men, and some other memorabilia from the Boston Public Library. We had poetry contests, special ones. We showed the movie, the Sacco and Vanzetti movie, on the New Haven Green. There was musical performances. People made new music to deal with Sacco and Vanzetti. And immigrant groups, African-American groups participated. And when we had this one-night performance at the Schubert Theater, it was only one night. We filled it up, 2,500 people. And tickets were, we gave a lot of them away, but most that we were charging $15. And we filled it up. And then Ben Shawn's paintings, the Yale University Art Gallery did it. So the first thing is Yes, it can be done. Yes, it should be done. There is a website that I have that I put together some years ago on Sacco and Vanzetti. In that website, there's a description in much more detail of precisely what I just described. And when I heard you at the beginning, Mariana, describe that this was going to be this important anniversary was coming of Sacco and Vanzetti and their arrest, the trial, the execution. This is a time period for precisely that longer period review, and not just by Italian Americans, but I want to come back to that, but by a lot of other people, because when we did it in New Haven, there weren't that many Italian Americans who actually staged things. They were sort of awed by all that was going on. It turned out to be a learning experience for many of them. But I think the notion of how do you tell this story? Why do you tell this story? It has such enormous relevance today. And I don't want to lose the thread that I was trying to describe earlier of there is a divide. There is a conflict over how does one become a good American? How do you do this? And that divide began during this time period. And it still is a divide. And it's something worth studying.
Yes.
It's something worth focusing on.
Yes.
And
so go ahead, I'm sorry.
Well, I don't know if that answers your question or his question there, or the viewer's question.
Well, I think, I'd actually like to kind of stay with that question, stay on this idea a little bit more. If I dare ask you to rehash a few things, I think it's very important, and bear with me as I try to kind of organize this stream of consciousness questions, comments. Much of what we're seeing on Facebook in the reaction to this lecture, judging by a lot of the comments that are being expressed, and we have more comments and questions for this particular lecture, as well as a number of personal recollections, some that are pretty telling. One viewer mentioned, as a kid, we were told not to tell anybody we were Italian American. That kind of sums it up, sums up what we're talking about. I know we all could probably sit down and have a giant therapy session about what it meant to be Italian American at different times in this nation's history. It seems, judging by the audience response, that there's this overwhelming sense of indignation among Italian Americans for, many of them are hearing this for the first time. They're asking, why weren't we taught this? Why was this just kind of glossed over? How come this wasn't part of my consciousness earlier? Italian Americans will debate certain topics, ad nauseum. They'll discuss, we'll discuss food or regional rivalries, but it's clear that we don't spend enough time discussing some of the more seminal events in our history. We often stick with the safer people. And there's a million people that come to mind. I'm not going to identify any of them at the moment, but we have limited knowledge of some of the events, the key events that shaped our grandparents, that shaped our parents, and in turn shaped us. Sacco and Vanzetti is being one of them. So this is kind of my question, and I thank you for your patience as I try to get to this point. Other groups, as you described, were more likely to adopt Sacco and Vanzetti as one of their own. Italian Americans have long been hesitant to do so for the reasons you described. There was that divide. We didn't want to be associated with radicals, the working class, with America's enemy during World War II. We didn't talk about events such as, lynchings and, Italians being described as a link between humans and apes. These were not topics that were considered acceptable to be discussed. And some people would still argue that, they don't have a place. As we as a nation are developing a greater consciousness for social justice issues, do you think that Italian Americans will kind of follow suit, that they will, explore this topic and others similar with more gusto? that maybe we've kind of moved past, you know, the discussion of cannoli and Sunday dinner. They're very important. They're a big part of our experience, but maybe now there's time to allow a little bit more to come in and enlighten us.
Yes, unequivocally, yes, it is the time to do that. And I'm fearful that if it's not done, that younger Italian Americans are going to wonder, why do they want to continue to be Italian Americans? Mm-hmm. Who exactly are the models? Who are they following? Who are they watching? Who are they learning from? What's their history? What is their cultural about? Was it just going to grandma's house over Christmas Eve or a holiday dinner with a grandparent? No, it was much more than that, because those people went through much more. Maybe they didn't tell you, but it doesn't mean that information is not out there. When I wrote this book on Sacco and Vanzetti, or the book about Bargiamatti, I was learning things sometimes for the first time. I thought I knew New Haven, Connecticut. I thought I understood urban renewal. I wasn't even close. It was so ugly. It was so brutal. And there actually is a lot out there. I mean, there are books, you know, you're familiar with Anthony Ricchio's book about the Italian Americans in New Haven. There are a lot more of that is being done. And what you have to do is to get deeper than just, we came over on the boat, and so the first image you have are these immigrants at Ellis Island or at New Orleans or Boston. That's the wrong place to start.
Okay. We came over on the boat and we wanted to be American. That's often the narrative. Well,
I think it is. And they did want to be good Americans. They just they wanted to do it without being discrimination. They wanted to do it without being lynched, without having the law work against them so much. That was their experience in Italy. And I want to come back to women, because I do think, I mean, I was deliberate about it because it's so clear in the history when you get deep into it. This role that women played in Southern Italy, had fighters, seamstress, labor leaders. The men were in the farms. The women not only took care of the home, they were working. And so when they came to America, the transition was much smoother in one sense. They did in the United States exactly what they were doing in Italy. They fought for their rights. They had skills. They also raised families. And in most households, they also were responsible for the money. That is, they knew how to manage the money. It wasn't the husband. He was working. They were working too, but they understood the money and how to save. And so there are powerful images and names and people to be focused on who were involved in this history and need that attention. Now, the information is out there. Everything I wrote about in my book, it all comes out of, not all of it, but much of it came out of the Yale archives. Now, you won't find a Yale historian talking about it. There are plenty of books out there by Yale historians about New Haven, about Yale University, and Yale's history. None of them mention eugenics. They don't talk about it. It's as if there's some, well, you could write about this, but not about this.
Well, I guess everybody there's that desire to sweep certain aspects of the history under their carpet, right?
Well, yes, and I think that's right. But it is now such an important time. Identity is critical. And I was giving a talk the other day, not on Sacco and Vanzetti, but on the book, actually, at a state college, a state university in New Haven, Connecticut. And I was asked by a woman from a student from, now it's a state school, so these are not wealthy kids at all. This is a woman whose parents had just come from India. They were very sort of working class people, and she was in school, and she wanted to talk about how could she be a good American and keep some identity from her family? And the question was, how can I do that? And I said, it's easy. Stick with your family. Stick with retaining those values. Figure out as best you can where they came from. And you'll figure out how to use those in America. And I think that that's something Italians need to do, and they need to do it for their children.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, you think about how different it would have been, you know, if this great immigration, if this massive immigration, you know, took place years later, right? When, you know, now we embrace the Mediterranean diet, and there's so many aspects of Italianità that are, you know, are cherished and uphold, you know, and, you know, times were very different a century ago. And I think that's one of the key, one of the many key lessons to take away from this lecture tonight is, you know, we were there yesterday. And, you know, it's up to us to ensure that those stories are preserved, and that those, you know, very simply put, that these travesties of justice, you know, do not occur again. And unfortunately, you know, they have at various times in history. There is one more question, and it's kind of a fragment. But one of our viewers is asking you to say a few words about Governor Dukakis and the 1977 proclamation declaring August 23rd Sacco and Vanzetti Memorial Day. Is this day still celebrated and recognized, or was that kind of a one-time proclamation? Is there something that maybe we can do to revive it?
Good question. It turned out that, well, let me answer that part of it first, but I want to come back to Dukakis, who I've met a number of times, and he came to New Haven during 2002 when we had this event to give a talk. To my knowledge, the date still exists as a date of recognition. Whether anyone does anything about it is different. And there is a group in Cambridge, the Dante Alighieri Society, that I believe they were the ones who hosted this event that I attended in 1997. And we collectively worked to get the governor and the mayor to accept this plaque. They pay attention to it. And so do others. And it's a date that Italian Americans and Italian American organizations should recognize in some way, and encourage others to recognize it. But in encouraging others to recognize it, one of the things I did learn in the course of doing all this research, beginning in probably in the mid-90s, through when I basically tried to stop in 2002, and then I revisited it in the Fearless book, was the immigrants who are coming to America, who want to come to America. I found they know this story. It's not alien to them. It's part of their preparation. It was for a lot of the people I met at the time in surprising places. And so it was being taught. And now
it's up to Americans to learn from it.
Well, yes. And so, I say that because, and let me come back to this 2002 experience. The power of this story is bigger. It's a lesson not only for Italian Americans, so it's one that can be shared, and it should be shared. Yeah. So it is one thing, as it should be, that perhaps you decide on August the 23rd of next year, you're going to have some celebration or some event or some little talk or whatever it might be. But it's also something that could be shared in a broader community. And the joy would be is if you could go to the local rabbi and the synagogue, because Jews were very important. The newspaper, the Forward, they were big supporters of Sacco and Vanzetti. And so you find all these niches everywhere in groups that you didn't didn't know existed, but they're out there and they know about this. One of the Borglum plaque, there's actually a couple of variations of it. There's the one that's now in the Boston Public Library. That's why I said to you before, as I was describing it, there's this plaster cast that was made. That's what that is that you put up. The original, I think, was destroyed, but the plaster cast survived. Well, there's another one in a small community church on Commonwealth Avenue in Boston. And it's where one of them went and they kept it. It's on their wall. And when I say a community church, it doesn't look like a church. It looks like it's the third floor of a building. It's a very common looking building, but on the third floor is this community church. And there it was. So it's out there. And I can't encourage people strongly enough to go through what I did. I'm done doing it, but there's so much out there. And there's so many, so much research that you can still work on and still find. So it's a great story. It's an important story. And it's an American story in a lot of different ways, about justice, about immigration, about the duty of government, about the Catholic Church. This Catholic social teaching was very, Mother Cabrini, I don't know why there aren't enough statues of her out there.
Well, New York is working on one.
So there should be. So it is a great story, and there's so many threads to it that really are worth undertaking.
Very good. Well, we thank you so much for presenting this program tonight, and it has, I think, delivered everything that you described, especially the revelation. But we'd like to remind our viewers that we're going to be giving away 10 copies of your new book, Fearless. So the first 10 people to make a contribution to the IAMLA will receive a copy of the book, Fearless, A. Bartlett Jamadi and the Battle for Fairness in America. All contributions to the IAMLA are tax deductible, and they support programs like this. Neil, can you tell people, if they don't get your book from the IAMLA, where should they go? What wonderful independent bookseller or other place should they go to purchase a copy?
Well, I will tell you what I learned in this process. Every independent bookseller today, in every hometown that's close to where any one of these viewers live, would love to take an order for this book.
Right.
And I say that because all they need to do is they will call the publisher or they will call their own distributor, and they would love to they would love to get the copy of the book for you. You can go to Amazon, they have it. You can go to Barnes and Noble, they have it. You can go directly to the publisher, to State University of New York Press, they have it. And they'll get it to you fairly quickly. But if you go to your local independent bookstore, you will be doing them a wonderful favor. And they can get it to you at the exact same price. It might take an extra day or two, but I couldn't encourage you strongly enough to support those community independent bookstores.
Wonderful, absolutely. And I'm going to include just 2 unsolicited shout outs to Romans, a historic bookstore in Pasadena. I think they've been in business for over 130 years. One of the many institutions that's suffering a bit right now because of COVID. And of course, our friends in Boston, IAM Books, Italian American Books. Those are just 2 folks that come to mind, but there's many, many others. Support your local bookseller. Thank you so much again. We look forward to doing future programs together when we can reconvene in the museum. But one of the things that we love about this format is, though it does feel a little bit strange to us, it allows us to, share this content with people without being restricted by geography. People will be able to tune into this lecture long after its initial broadcast. So we're able to reach that many more folks. And if you are viewing, if you're joining us tonight and you like what you saw, Please follow the Italian American Museum of Los Angeles on Facebook or Instagram, and subscribe to our YouTube channel so that you don't miss any of the content that we're working on for you. Neil, thanks so much again. I'm so happy that we were able to do this, and you're truly a wealth of information. I enjoyed the discussion so much.
Thank you very much, Mariana. I appreciate it, and I appreciate, again, the help of your colleagues in organizing this. This technology is very tricky.
Thank you.
And I'm glad we were able to deal with it. And again, I want to thank the Italian Sons and Daughters of America for participating as well.
Good luck with the book, Fearless, A. Bartlett Giamatti and the Battle for Fairness in America. We look forward to you doing a presentation at the museum in the near future.
Oh, me too. Good.
Yes.
Thank you. See
Stay
you.
safe, everyone. Have a great evening. Thank you.